Yeah, so he was born a century ago in Germany to a Jewish family there, and he eventually would come to the United States as a refugee at the age of 15, where he went to school in New York City. But then he very quickly was drafted into the army just a few years later and went back to Germany. And it was in Germany where he worked in intelligence for the U.S. military, where he really started the process of gaining access to the highest levels of power. So he was a pretty influential individual in terms of advising the U.S. occupying forces in post-war Germany. Then he would come back to the United States, go to Harvard, then very quickly become a faculty at Harvard before he would then launch his career into advising presidents, where he started with Nixon, or I should say, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, then Nixon, then Ford, and altogether 12 presidents altogether. He was someone who was extremely influential, and as you said, there are few individuals, unelected individuals, I should say, in the U.S. government, who are both celebrated and despised at the same time, like he was.
What foreign policy moments will he be most remembered for, do you think?
Oh, there are so many. As I said, he advised, some 12 presidents, and he was the only thus far to ever be both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the same time. And his influence went beyond just advising presidents. He was seen as a major advisor for all things related to China, especially once he left office. But I think the number one actually probably would be China. For those who celebrate his success as a foreign policy expert, it would be the opening up of China and his peeling away of China from the Soviet Union and detente with the Soviet Union. The way that Nixon went to China, that was thanks to trips by Kissinger, who set that all up. But then those who would call him a war criminal would focus especially on his efforts in Latin America to overthrow governments there, in Cambodia and Laos, talking about the bombing campaigns there, that he won a Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Vietnam War, but few few at the time maybe realized just the extent of the carnage that was caused by the United States with the very active support of Henry Kissinger.
So why then was that Nobel Peace Prize that he was awarded so controversial?
Well, at the same time that he was advising the Johnson administration on what to do on Vietnam and how to extricate the U.S. from there to a certain extent, he was also giving that information to the Nixon campaign, who was running against the Johnson campaign. And so he was really sort of playing both sides of the political aisle. And in many would posit that he really was furthering his own political fortunes at the expense of lives on the ground in Vietnam. And so while he may have gotten the U.S. out of Vietnam, he did not diminish the death toll of the war in Vietnam.
And as you mentioned, he continued to advise subsequent presidents after his term in office, right up until Joe Biden, as I understand it. So just how influential has he been on foreign policy over the past few decades even?
There are few individuals who are more recognized than him in foreign policy. It's important to note that his foreign policy, they call realism, that he's associated with the Kissinger approach to foreign policy is seen as realpolitik and realism. But I think what people maybe don't appreciate is, yes, realism talks about power and just maybe not as much on values and human rights, but I think people don't appreciate perhaps his background. He grew up he's in Germany that was in lacking stability, and in many ways that lack of stability really was something that he sought everywhere. So in his role as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor and as a trusted confidant to a dozen presidents, he wanted to not necessarily seek peace deals, but to seek stability, because he grew up in a world-leading country in Germany that he saw then fall into instability, and he then used that seeking of stability to eventually get peace deals, as you saw in the Middle East with Israel and some nations there, in its region, but you still, at the end of it, just want the Kissinger approach was, yes, realism, but it was stability. It was seeking out ways to balance power to further U.S. interest. And now, sometimes someone would say, many would say actually, that furthering those U.S. interests would come at the expense of democratic values, of human rights, but it's still, in Kissinger's view, he was a patriotic supporter of furthering U.S. interests at home and overseas.
And he was doing that right up until his final years. He was very active, even making a surprise visit to Beijing to meet President Xi Jinping after he had turned 100. That was middle of this year.
That's right. His ties to Beijing after office are probably something that he is particularly known for. His firm, Kissinger Associates, is sort of known throughout the business world as being one of the top advisors on how to do business in China. And many would posit that that Kissinger, after leaving office, refused to really acknowledge the human rights issues in China, even long after there was any sort of geopolitical rationale in terms of pulling China away from Russia. I mean, there was a geopolitical logic of trying to get Mao to work with the United States and pull him away from his any ties with the Soviet Union. But after the Cold War ended, there was less of that. And especially as Xi Jinping has become increasingly authoritarian at home and aggressive in his foreign policy overseas, the Kissinger approach to China, in which he diminished and really, and some would say, overlooked the human rights abuses there and the political interference that China has engaged in overseas, including in Australia, is something that has increasingly fallen out of favor. So many in China see the death of Kissinger as the end of an era of U.S.-China relations.
And overall, what do you think his legacy will be and his enduring impact on global foreign policy and politics?
That's hard to say. I think it's pretty mixed. As I said, he's both celebrated and despised. No one has been on the cover of Time magazine in the U.S. who is a U.S. government official who was not elected more than Henry Kissinger. And I think ultimately what I take away, and I think the value that many would point to, was the way that he really sought stability as a way to advance U.S. interest. And there is something to be said about that, but there's also something to be said about also seeking to incorporate the value of democracy and human rights. They don't have to be mutually exclusive of each other in the way that he might have thought at times.
Really interesting. Jared Mondschein, thank you so much for joining The World Tonight.
My pleasure.